Perhaps you're not happy with your MOS or your job in the United States Army, and you want to know, can I change my MOS in the Army? Maybe. I've actually covered this in a video in the past, but I wanted to update the YouTube algorithm because this is still a question I still get asked from time to time. Can I change my MOS? So updating the YouTube algorithm to inform some of those new subscribers we've gotten since then, new viewers since then, to let you know how that might work, but also cover a few other common things. Things like, what are some circumstances where I have to change my MOS? What are some circumstances where maybe I can get a second MOS? Because that's also a pretty common question I get too, is can I get a secondary MOS? So we're gonna cover those topics in today's video, but make sure you're hitting that subscribe button. I want you to be informed about the United States Army, learn stuff from me, so hit that subscribe button, click on that bell so you get alerts as soon as new videos go live, and become a part of that awesome notification platoon. So let's dive into things and let's talk about some scenarios where maybe, possibly, you could change your MOS. The key thing I want you to keep in mind is there is no guarantee. So do not rely on this. Do not think that, hey, I'm gonna join the United States Army at this MOS, and if I don't like it, I'll just change MOSs later on. Or maybe your plan is, hey, I wanna spend X amount of years at this MOS, then I wanna change this MOS, then I wanna change this MOS. Don't rely on that. That's probably not a scenario that you ideally can do. So let's start at the beginning, okay? You sign that contract for the United States Army for this specific MOS. You ship off to basic training, right? You complete basic training, you go off to AIT, right? So now you have to get the education to learn how to do that job in the United States Army. If during that time frame you fail that course, then potentially you could have to switch different MOSs to another job that maybe you don't want to do. Now, just because you failed once doesn't necessarily mean that'll happen. You could potentially get maybe a second chance, maybe a third chance, maybe a fourth chance. I don't know. It really just kind of depends sometimes on the leadership at that specific schoolhouse as far as how many chances they kind of want to give you based on your performance. Certain MOSs, you might not get a second chance. I think EOD is pretty strict to where you fail that sucker the first time, maybe you're lucky you get a second chance, and then after that you're done. You're switching to another MOS. So in some cases, if you do fail that school to learn how to do that MOS and be able to do it properly, you could find yourself in a scenario where you're going to be switched to a different MOS, and you're not going to get to pick that MOS commonly. Common in that case, they are going to put you in an MOS that they need people in. If that happens to be 11 Bravo, that happens to be a cook, that happens to be a mechanic, whatever is short at that moment, and they think that possibly you could possibly do, then you might get stuck doing that. They're gonna send you off to that AIT, go do that one, and then possibly that is gonna become your MOS, even if that's something you don't wanna do. But let's say you went for whatever MOS, right? You pass that school, you go off to your first unit, and now you're doing that job. And then after a while, you realize that, hey, this isn't quite what I expected it to be, and I wanna change MOSs. How is that done? For the most part, you cannot really just go and simply tell somebody, hey, I'm not really happy with this. Let's say it's been a year, maybe even 2 years, and you're like, I want to change MOSs. That really won't be an option for you at that point. The common time frame of when you might, and I say might because again, it's not guaranteed, but the time frame when you might be able to change MOSs is going to be when it's time to re-enlist. So if you did a 4-year contract, that 4-year contract is coming to an end, then possibly you can renegotiate to extend and do another contract, maybe sign another 4-year contract, but with the option to reclass to a different MOS. With that option, it is still gonna have the same kind of basic requirements when you're trying to join the Army. Do I qualify for this MOS? Is my ASVAB score good enough? You can retake the ASVAB even while you're in the Army to improve like your scores to be able to do such a thing, but you do still need those basic qualifications, and they have to be willing to take somebody that has already considered prior service because you already do have some time in the Army. There can be situations where they don't want soldiers that are already in the Army to be moving into that MOS. They want brand new people that this is their first MOS, and so they might not be taking new soldiers, or actually soldiers that are already been in the Army. They want new soldiers into this MOS. So in those situations, they might deny you. You might not qualify, or simply there just might not be any slots available for you to actually change over to that MOS. So that's why I say it's not guaranteed. Do not rely on that. Do not count on that being an option. But that is the time frame when maybe, if it is available, you could potentially do that. I have known people to do that. There is a little bit more leniency and a little bit more common kind of availability to do that maybe on the Reserves and National Guard, because that's harder to make promotions, right? You're, let's say, a 88 Mike in the National Guard or the Reserves, and you can't get promoted to sergeant because of slots. And Reserves and National Guard work differently than like active duty. So like active duty, you get promoted to, let's say, an E5 or a sergeant, as an 88 Mike, but you're at a unit that doesn't have an actual slot for you. They're just going to relocate you somewhere else. They can't really do that in Reserves and National Guard. So that's when people often will simply change their MOS so that they can get promoted. So they're not just kind of stuck being an E4 forever. They want to move up in the ranks, and maybe at that unit there is some slots for this specific MOS. So they request to reclass to that other MOS so that they can get promoted, so they can get one of those slots. So it does kind of seem like it's a little bit easier of a thing. I wouldn't say like guaranteed, but probably easier on the reserve side because of that factor. But on active duty, commonly when you're going to try to rechange your MOS or change your MOS or reclass to another MOS, that's probably going to be done if you re-enlist for that option and it's available for you. There is, in very, very rare circumstances, times where we'll be forced to change MOSs. I've only really seen that probably maybe once or twice in the last like 10 years or so, maybe 20 years type of thing, where they had a specific MOS that was over strength. They had a lot of individuals, E4 and below, that they just had too many of those people in that MOS, and they wanted people to get out of the MOS. So they were actually giving them options to either change their MOS or just get out of the army early, because they were kind of looking for volunteers first, and then if they didn't get enough volunteers, then they were gonna start forcing people to do one or the other. But they did get enough volunteers to where they were able to, you know, kind of reduce the numbers and from that MOS to not be overstrength anymore. But those individuals in that situation got the opportunity to either just get out of the army early or go ahead and reclassify to a different MOS. But don't count on that, because like I said, I think I've only seen it like once or twice in the last like 10, 20 years, something like that. So that's not very common, but that potentially could be a thing. So really outside of your contract being eligible to be renewed, there probably isn't an opportunity for you on active duty for you to try to change to a different MOS, because you're bored with that MOS, you don't like it, it's not what you thought it was, and you want to change to a different job in the Army, different MOS. You're probably gonna have to wait until you're eligible to actually re-enlist, and then talk to your retention NCO and see if it is an option for you to try and change to a different MOS. And then if it's not, then you have to make a decision to suck it up and stick with that MOS if you want to stay in the Army, or maybe move on and get out, or maybe even switch over to the Army Reserves or National Guard, and maybe they will allow you to change over to a different MOS because the National Guard or the Reserve unit you're trying to head over to out of active duty maybe has some slots at that MOS. So the main thing with that, do not count on it. Do not think that if I don't like this MOS, I'll just simply change it. I've even heard of some people saying that their goal was to spend X amount of years at this MOS, then change the MOSs to another one. Spend X amount of years at that MOS, then change MOSs again, right? You'll be lucky to be able to change MOSs once probably on active duty, right? Might less a second time. So I would not count on that kind of scenario to be able to try to like, I want to do infantry, I want to do military police, and then I want to do like intel, let's say as an example, right? That's possibly not going to be an option for you. Maybe you might get lucky and be able to change your MOS once, but probably once you get to a certain rank, they're probably not gonna want you changing MOSs, especially if you're on active duty. Maybe on the Reserves and National Guard, but definitely gonna be a lot harder to do on active duty. So then get into that second one, right? I've had people ask me, hey, I wanna have a secondary MOS. Can I have a secondary MOS? Maybe. This used to be a little bit more common like earlier in the days of the Army, maybe like in the 90s and the 80s, maybe even the early 2000s, where that was a possibility. It has gotten a little bit less of a possibility in current days Army. Primarily though, on active duty. I mean, there are some MOSs that do allow options for you to change MOSs to have a secondary MOS and your primary MOS. So as an example, right, the main one I remember seeing a lot was fuelers, right? You have a fueler that has their primary MOS as a fueler and their secondary MOS as an 88 mic, because they do kind of go hand in hand, right? You have fuel trucks that you have to drive, so it's important to learn how to drive these trucks. So it makes sense for you to get a secondary MOS of an 88 mic. That is usually the key thing with it. They usually want you to, if you're gonna add a secondary MOS, for it to have some kind of relevance to your primary MOS, something that can enhance your abilities as a primary MOS, right? Not a situation where I want to be, let's say, a 88 mic, but my secondary MOS is an infantry because it sounds cool and I'll be able to do stuff with weapons. Not going to be available. Again, this one's also kind of a thing where I've seen it a little bit more common in today's Army on Reserves and National Guard, where they don't mind you going and picking up a secondary MOS because it can help that unit with you having a little bit of extra knowledge. On active duty, they'd rather just bring in a soldier that's actually that MOS, so it may be a little bit more of a challenge on active duty to pick up a secondary MOS. There's really not a whole lot of instances that I've seen people on active duty be able to do this. That was really the main common one, was fuelers with a secondary MOS of 88 mic. Outside of that, it seems to be fairly rare-ish, I think. I don't think I've seen it as a whole, you know, a lot of individuals that do have like a primary MOS and a secondary MOS. But if you do talk to people, maybe they were in the Army in the 80s, 90s, those kind of things, it actually seemed like it was pretty common back then. But current day Army, they don't really need to do that. My question to my viewers out there, I want you to comment down below. Maybe my old school individuals that were in the 80s, 90s, early 2000s kind of a thing. What were some common scenarios? Maybe you had a primary MOS and a secondary MOS, or maybe you knew somebody in the Army that had a primary and a secondary MOS. What was their primary and secondary, or what was your primary and secondary if you had that situation? So let me know down in the comment section down below. If you're currently in the Army and you have that situation, whether you're on active duty, reserve, National Guard, I want to hear about that down in the comment section down below so we can find out what types of MOSs people are able to get that primary and secondary MOS. Also, those of you that have reclassed, right? I want to hear from you guys in the comment section as well. If you had a situation where you were in the Army as one specific MOS and then you re-enlisted, or you had an opportunity to reclass to a different MOS, what did you reclass to? And what was, which one was the better one? Did you regret reclassing? Was it a good move? Did it turn out to be a better option for you? Let me know down in the comment section down below. If you're not yet in the Army, or maybe you're even currently in the Army, hell, it doesn't really matter too much. I want to know from you, what do you think would be a great primary MOS and a secondary MOS? The sky's the limit, right? Let's say the Army doesn't care if they're relative to each other or not. What would you choose as a primary and a secondary if you could pick anything in the Army would allow you to do that and they didn't care if they were relative to each other? I probably still would pick something probably relative to each other, like maybe something like public affairs, and then the MOS that's like for video production. I forget specifically what that MOS is, but those two probably are relative to each other. So knowing what I know now and my interests that I currently have nowadays, that's probably what I would want to do. But I want to hear from you guys down in the comment section down below. So just always keep in mind, there's no guarantee you can change your MOS. You might not be able to change your MOS, but you might. There might be some situations where you could change your MOS, but just don't expect that that is going to be a guaranteed thing. So it's important to make sure that you pick a good MOS, a good job when you're going into the Army, so that hopefully you don't have to worry about that. But there can still be some situations where you thought this was a great MOS, this was a great job, and then it turned out to be not as cool as you thought it was. But I do have a video that I did a long time ago that talked about the top 5 MOSs, and maybe that helps you make a good decision as far as what MOSs might be good. And so you can check that video out right here. Make sure you're subscribed to the channel, make sure you hit that thumbs up, make sure you check out the affiliate links to support the channel and get some awesome discounts and some great merchandise that you might want in the first place. Thanks for hanging out. I'm Christopher Chaos, and I'll see you next time. See ya.